The Lion. Lion L. Johnson's Complete History. Caliban, the Dark Angels, and His Awakening. Among the Emperor's 20 sons, each a demigod forged to conquer the galaxy and unite humanity beneath the golden light of the Imperium, one stands apart in ways both profound and troubling. Lion L. Johnson, first among equals, Primarch of the First Legion, bearer of the title Primaris Angelus Mortis, the first angel of death. His story begins not in triumph but in darkness, not in brotherhood but in isolation. And though he would rise to become one of the Imperium's greatest warriors, his legacy would forever be haunted by secrets, betrayal, and a shame that would echo across 10,000 years. To understand the Lion is to understand contradiction. He was the Emperor's first creation, the prototype upon which all other Primarchs would be based, yet he remained the most enigmatic of his brothers. Where Horus inspired devotion and Guilliman commanded respect through reason, the Lion inspired something closer to fear. A grim certainty that when he arrived on the battlefield, nothing would be left alive. He was a hunter before all else, shaped not by human civilization, but by the monsters that prowled the death world of Caliban. And though he would learn the ways of men, he would never truly understand them. His tactical brilliance was undeniable, his courage beyond question. But the human warmth that bound other Primarchs to their sons remained forever beyond his grasp. The Emperor of Mankind crafted the Primarchs in the deepest laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains of Terra, each infant demigod gestating within specialized pods, their genetic structures incorporating powers and abilities beyond mortal comprehension. The Emperor intended these beings to serve as generals in his Great Crusade, to lead vast armies of transhuman space marines in the reconquest of the galaxy. But the Chaos Gods, those malevolent entities dwelling within the Immaterium, perceived the threat these creations posed to their dominion. Through a psychic maelstrom of unimaginable power, they tore the infant Primarchs from their father's laboratory and scattered them across the galaxy like seeds cast into an endless void. Each Primarch landed on a different world, and each world would shape them in profound ways. Some landed among nobility and learned statecraft, others among warriors and learned honor, still others among techno-barbarians and learned survival. Lion L. Johnson, designated as the first, landed on Caliban, and Caliban was unlike any other world in the Imperium. Located in what would become known as Segmentum Obscurus, dangerously close to the Eye of Terror, that vast wound in reality where the warp bled into the Materium, Caliban had been touched by the corrupting influence of chaos from millennia. Its surface was covered almost entirely by vast forests, dense and primeval, stretching from pole to pole in an unbroken canopy of ancient trees. Beautiful from orbit, the world revealed its true nature only to those who walked beneath that canopy. For the forests of Caliban were not empty.
The proximity to the Eye of Terror had warped the wildlife into nightmarish forms. Creatures of impossible size and malevolence prowled the endless woods, beasts that had incorporated elements of demonic corruption into their very flesh. They were called the Great Beasts by the human population, and they had driven civilization to the edge of extinction. Humanity on Caliban clung to existence in fortified settlements. Their culture regressed to a feudal state dominated by knightly orders who fought endless defensive wars against the creatures of the forest. These knights, organized into various orders based around fortress monasteries, represented the finest warriors Caliban could produce, yet even they could only slow the advance of the monsters, never truly defeat them. Into this nightmare world fell the infant who would become the Lion. His gestation pod impacted in the deepest, darkest heart of the forest, far from any human habitation. The impact crater scarred the ancient trees, but the forest quickly reclaimed it. What happened in those first moments after his arrival remains a mystery. How did an infant, even a Primarch, survive in such a hostile environment? The answer lies in the nature of the Primarchs themselves. They were not merely superhuman, they possessed an adaptability that bordered on the miraculous. The child survived because survival was encoded into his very genes, because the Emperor had created beings capable of thriving in any environment, no matter how hostile. For 10 years, Lion L. Johnson lived alone in the forests of Caliban. 10 years in which he saw no human face, heard no human voice, learned no human language. His education came from the monsters that hunted him, and later that he hunted in turn. Primarchs matured at an accelerated rate, their bodies and minds developing far faster than normal humans. By the time he was discovered, the boy had become larger than a grown man, his muscles hardened by constant combat, his senses honed to preternatural sharpness. He learned to track the great beasts through the eternal twilight beneath the canopy, to identify their weaknesses, to kill with efficiency rather than rage. He became what the forest demanded, the ultimate predator. The Primarch's survival would later be the subject of much speculation among imperial scholars. Some ancient Calibanite legends spoke of a forest spirit that had haunted the depths for nearly a century before the line's discovery, a being of small stature but human form who left mysterious marks in his wake. Whether these legends refer to the lion or to something else entirely remains unclear. What is certain is that when the Knights of the Order finally encountered him, they faced something that terrified even veteran warriors. The legends do not record the exact circumstances of that first meeting, but they speak of blood and violence, of a wild man larger than any human should be, wounded by a bolt weapon fired in panic, covered in the gore of a freshly slain great beast, his eyes feral and uncomprehending.
Most of the knights prepared to kill what they perceived as another monster of the forest. They raised their weapons, fingers tightening on triggers, ready to add this strange creature to the long list of horrors they had destroyed. But one knight stepped forward and stayed their hands. His name was Luther, and he was among the greatest heroes Caliban had ever produced. Luther possessed not only martial prowess, but also a keen mind and the rare ability to perceive qualities in others that remained hidden. Looking into the wild man's eyes, Luther saw something beneath the feral rage, a spark of intelligence, a capacity for something more than animal violence. Rather than kill, Luther chose to approach. His skill with words, honed through years of diplomacy between the various knightly orders, allowed him to slowly, carefully communicate with the savage before him. It took hours of patient effort before the wild man lowered his guard. Luther offered food and water, speaking in soothing tones, gradually convincing this creature that not all humans were threats to be killed or avoided. When finally the wild man allowed himself to be led away from the forest, Luther brought him back to the fortress monastery of the order, the greatest stronghold on Caliban, a massive structure of stone and steel built to withstand sieges by the great beasts. There, in the courtyard of that ancient fortress, Luther gave the savage a name. In the Calibanite dialect of Low Gothic, he called him Lion L. Johnson, the lion, son of the forest, both in honor of where he was found and because his fierceness and golden hair reminded Luther of the Calibanite lion, the most feared of all the great beasts. The transformation of the feral youth into a knight of the order proved remarkable even by the standards of Caliban's warrior elite. Lion L. Johnson learned to speak with astonishing speed, mastering the Calibanite language in mere weeks. He absorbed the customs, rituals, and codes of honor that governed knightly conduct with the same efficiency with which he had learned to hunt monsters. Yet he never spoke of those 10 years in the forest, maintaining a silence about his early life that he would carry for the rest of his existence. Whether this was because the memories were too alien to communicate, or because he chose to bury that savage past beneath the veneer of civilization, none could say. Under Luther's tutelage, the Lion became more than just another knight. He demonstrated tactical brilliance that surpassed even the most experienced warriors of the order. Where others saw only immediate threats, the Lion perceived patterns, weaknesses to exploit, strategies to implement. His mind worked with a clarity and speed that seemed almost inhuman, analyzing battlefield conditions and formulating responses faster than his human companions could follow. More than that, he possessed an unshakable will, an absolute determination that, once he had decided on a course of action, nothing could deter him from seeing it through to completion.
This combination of genius and determination quickly elevated him through the ranks of the order. Luther and the Lion formed a partnership that, for a time, seemed unbreakable. They complemented each other perfectly. Luther provided the oratory skills, the political acumen, the ability to inspire and lead through personal charisma. The Lion provided the strategic vision, the tactical brilliance, the cold calculation necessary to win battles that seemed unwinnable. Together, they rose through the hierarchy of the order, undertaking quests that earned them fame across Caliban. They slew great beasts that had terrorized entire regions for generations. They recovered lost artifacts from the depths of the forest. They negotiated alliances between rival knightly orders. Their names became synonymous with victory, and where they went, others followed. Yet even in these early days, seeds were being sown that would eventually bear terrible fruit. As their fame grew, it became increasingly clear that the Lion was the superior warrior, the better tactician, the one to whom others looked for leadership in the most desperate moments. Luther, who had discovered the savage in the forest and given him his name, found himself increasingly cast in the role of second in command. To the outside world, they remained brothers in arms, equal partners in glorious deeds. But Luther felt the sting of always standing in another's shadow. And though he loved the Lion as the son he might have had, as the brother he had chosen, that love began to curdle into something darker. The turning point came when the Lion proposed something that had never been done before on Caliban, a grand crusade to exterminate the great beasts once and for all. For generations, the knightly orders had fought defensive wars, protecting their strongholds and the human populations clustered around them. But the Lion envisioned something different, an offensive campaign that would carry war into the deepest forests, hunting down every nest, every lair, every spawning ground until the monsters were extinct. It was an audacious plan, some said impossible. But Luther, using his considerable skills of persuasion, convinced the grand masters of other monastic orders to pledge their forces to this crusade. Within months, an army unlike any Caliban had ever seen assembled under the banner of the order. The crusade lasted nearly a full decade. It was brutal, bloody work that claimed thousands of lives. For every great beast destroyed, countless knights fell to tooth and claw. They fought through primeval forests where sunlight never reached the ground, through swamps that bubbled with unnatural miasma, through mountain caves where nightmares bred in darkness. The Lion led from the front, his tactical genius and personal prowess inspiring others to deeds of valor they might never have thought themselves capable of. But he also displayed a ruthlessness that disturbed even hardened warriors. When he determined that certain regions had been so corrupted by the great beasts that they could never be reclaimed, he ordered those areas burned to ash, accepting no arguments about the forest's beauty or the loss of hunting grounds.
Not all of Caliban's nobility supported this campaign. Some feared the changes it would bring to their traditional society. The Knights of Lupus, a powerful order from the northern forests, openly opposed the crusade. They had, unknown to most, been capturing and training great beasts for generations, maintaining the status quo that gave them power. More sinister, they had become corrupted by chaos, their connection to an ancient warp-tainted artifact leading them down a dark path. When diplomatic overtures failed, the Lion showed no mercy. The Knights of Lupus were hunted down and destroyed to the last man, their fortresses torn down, their names struck from Calibanite records as a warning to any who would oppose the Crusade. As the 10th year of the Crusade drew to a close, the great beasts had been driven to the edge of extinction. Only scattered survivors remained in the most remote regions, no longer a civilization-threatening menace, but merely isolated dangers. The Lion stood at the pinnacle of his achievements, the savior of Caliban, master of all the knightly orders that had survived the Crusade. It was then that he was offered the title of Supreme Grand Master of the Order, ruler of all Caliban. He accepted without fanfare or celebration, for such human ceremonies still seemed alien to him. He understood duty, understood the logic of accepting command commensurate with his abilities, but the human desire for recognition and reward remained foreign to his nature. Luther stood beside him at that ceremony, sharing in the glory, yet something had changed irrevocably. The Lion had eclipsed his mentor completely. Where once they had been brothers, now they were master and subordinate. Luther hid his resentment well, his face showing nothing but pride and loyalty. But deep within, jealousy had taken root, a slow poison that would corrupt him over the decades to come. Had the Emperor not arrived when he did, perhaps this wound might have healed with time. But the Emperor came, and everything changed. The arrival of the Emperor of Mankind on Caliban represented a moment of transformation not just for the Lion, but for the entire planet. Imperial scouts, equipped with technology that seemed like sorcery to the Calibanites, had detected the psychic emanations of a Primarch. The Emperor himself, accompanied by elements of his First Legion, descended from the heavens in vessels of unimaginable size. To the people of Caliban, it must have seemed like the coming of gods. But to the Lion, in that first moment of meeting, it meant something different. He felt an instant, undeniable connection to the towering figure in golden armor, a recognition that transcended words or conscious thought. This was his father, his creator, the purpose for which he had been made. The Emperor wasted no time. Upon confirming the Lion's identity, he immediately granted him command of the First Legion of Space Marines. These warriors had been created from the Lion's own genetic material, transhuman soldiers who carried his gene seed in their bodies.
They were his sons, after a fashion, though they had fought for decades without their Primarch. The Emperor also recognized the quality of the warriors the Lion had trained on Caliban. Those Knights of the Order who were young enough underwent the full Astartes transformation, becoming true Space Marines. Those too old, like Luther, received partial augmentation, biochemical and surgical enhancements that elevated them beyond normal humanity, though they would never match true Astartes. The Lion formally renamed the First Legion the Dark Angels, drawing on an old Calibanite myth that spoke of grim, hooded figures who brought death to the wicked. The name reflected the Legion's character perfectly. They were not golden heroes like the Emperor's children, or inspiring champions like the Blood Angels. They were killers, efficient and remorseless, who descended upon their foes like angels of death. Luther, as the Lion's closest companion, was made second in command of the entire Legion, the first among the enhanced humans who would serve alongside the true Astartes. For Lionel Johnson, this should have been a moment of pure triumph. He had found his purpose, his place in the grand design of his father. He commanded a legion of transhuman warriors, possessed a fleet of powerful warships, including the Invincible Reason, the first Gloriana-class battleship ever constructed. He was given the title of Lord of the First, Primaris Angelus Mortis, First Angel of Death. As the firstborn Primarch, the prototype from which all others derived, he held a position of unique significance. Yet the lion accepted these honors with the same lack of ceremony with which he had accepted leadership of the order. To him, they were simply acknowledgments of capability, the proper ordering of a hierarchy based on merit. Before departing Caliban to join the Great Crusade, the lion tested his legion. He insisted on dueling the captain of each company, warrior against warrior, to establish his worthiness to lead. These contests were not mere ceremonies. The lion faced Astartes warriors clad in Terminator armor, veterans of decades of warfare, and defeated them while wearing no armor at all. His Primarch physiology, his decades of combat against great beasts, his sheer skill, all combined to make him more than a match for even the finest warriors his legion could produce. Through these duels, he earned not just obedience, but respect, proving through action rather than words that he deserved to command. The legion he inherited was in a state of crisis. During the years before his discovery, the First Legion had been the Emperor's finest weapon, the prototype and standard by which all other legions were judged. They had pioneered tactics and strategies, field-tested equipment and doctrines, served as the vanguard of the Great Crusade. But they had also developed internal divisions. Different factions within the Legion, grouped into informal formations called hosts, each championed different approaches to warfare. The Council of Masters, the Legion's leadership in the Primarch's absence, had fractured into competing interests. They needed their Primarch not just to lead them in battle, but to heal these divisions.
The lion approached this challenge with characteristic decisiveness. He merged the Calibinite knightly traditions with the Legion's existing hexagrammaton system, creating something new from the combination. The hexagrammaton, consisting of 6 specialized wings, each focused on a particular aspect of warfare, became formalized under his command. The Death Wing specialized in close-quarters Terminator assaults. The Raven Wing focused on rapid strike operations. The Dread Wing wielded the most terrible weapons of mass destruction. The Fire Wing conducted covert operations and intelligence gathering. The Iron Wing commanded armored warfare. The Storm Wing led void operations. Each wing had its place, its purpose, its traditions, and together they formed a legion capable of prosecuting any type of warfare. With his legion reorganized and his authority established, the lion embarked on his first campaign. The target was Carcarsarn, a world that had rebelled against Ultramarines' garrison forces. The battle served as the Dark Angels' announcement to the galaxy. They fought with a precision and ferocity that swept aside the rebels and rescued the beleaguered Ultramarines. Robert Guilliman himself took note of the First Legion's capabilities, though he also noted the line's secretive nature and reluctance to share operational details even with allied forces. But the lion's greatest test, the campaign that would define his early career and forever alter the Dark Angel's position within the Empire, came with the Rangdan Xenocides. In the year 862.M30, a Xenos threat emerged from the darkness beyond the halo stars that dwarfed anything the Imperium had yet faced. The Rangda were not merely aliens, they represented a nightmare made manifest. They possessed technology that matched or exceeded the Imperium's finest weapons, wielded psychic powers that could shatter minds, and demonstrated an ability to corrupt and control other species, turning them into enslaved armies. The northern reaches of the Imperium found themselves facing an existential threat. The Rangdan Xenocides would span nearly 3 decades and claim more lives than any other campaign of the Great Crusade before the Horus Heresy itself. Multiple Space Marine legions participated in the fighting, but the Dark Angels bore the lion's share of the burden. They fought in the vanguard, facing the worst the Rangda could deploy, holding the line when victory seemed impossible. The lion himself led his warriors into the teeth of the enemy advance. His tactical genius and personal valor inspired feats of heroism that became legendary even among the Astartes. The campaigns were brutal beyond description. The Dark Angels fought battles where they were outnumbered 100 to 1.
where entire companies were lost holding critical positions just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. They fought in void battles that lasted weeks, both fleets so evenly matched that neither could gain decisive advantage. They fought on worlds that had been transformed into nightmares by Rangdan biotechnology, where the very ground tried to kill them and the air carried toxins that could dissolve ceramite. The Lion adapted to every challenge, developing new tactics to counter each Rangdan stratagem, never yielding ground without exacting a terrible price. During the darkest days of the conflict, when it seemed the Imperium might actually fall, the Emperor himself took direct command of operations. But even the Master of Mankind could not be everywhere at once. When the Lion was discovered and brought to the war, the Emperor ceded overall command to his firstborn son. It was an unprecedented honor, a demonstration of the Emperor's confidence in the Lion's abilities. Those dark angels who fought during this period swore that the war would have been lost without their Primarch's leadership, that he was the Rangdan's destroyer, the one figure they could not overcome. Yet victory came at a devastating cost. The third Rangdan Xenocide, the final campaign that broke the Xenos threat once and for all, cost the Dark Angels 50,000 Astartes. 50,000 warriors, each one a precious resource that had taken years to create and decades to train, spent in preventing the destruction of the Northern Imperium. The casualties were so severe that the Legion never truly recovered. Where once they had been the largest and most prestigious of the Space Marine legions, they now found themselves eclipsed by legions that had not participated in the Rangdan Wars. The Ultramarines, who had been fighting campaigns in the Galactic West, suddenly became the largest legion. The Luna Wolves, led by the charismatic Horus Lupercal, claimed the most visible victories. The Dark Angels, though they had saved the Imperium itself, found themselves relegated to second-tier status in the eyes of many. Worse, dark rumors began to circulate about what the Dark Angels had done during the Rangdan Xenocides. The Dreadwing had deployed weapons of such terrible power that entire star systems had been rendered lifeless. Whisper spoke of methods of warfare that skirted dangerously close to forbidden technology. The Lion and his legion had won, but the price of victory included not just casualties, but their reputation. During this period, an enigmatic figure approached the Lion. A warrior identifying himself as Alpharius, though the Alpha Legion had not yet been discovered and its Primarch remained unknown, offered aid. This mysterious Astarte suggested that the Dark Angels could withdraw and rebuild their strength, while the Alpha Legion secretly took over operations against the Rangdan. It was an offer that would have preserved the Dark Angels' position as the premier legion, maintained their readiness to be named when the Emperor eventually appointed a War Master. The Lion refused. Whatever else might be said about him, he was not one to shirk duty or accept easy paths. He had been given command of the Rangdan War, and he would see it through to completion regardless of the cost. Whether this decision was made from honor, from stubbornness, or from a lack of understanding about political maneuvering among his brother Primarchs remains unclear. What is certain is that it cost him his chance at the title of War Master. By the time the Rangdan threat was finally eliminated, other Primarchs had risen to prominence, and the Lion's secretive nature had made him many rivals but few friends among his brothers. When the Emperor finally named Horus Lupercal as War Master, granting him supreme command over all Space Marine legions, the Lion accepted the decision with cynical resignation. He had never sought glory or recognition for its own sake, never desired political power or influence. He understood duty, understood that someone had to command, and if the Emperor had judged Horus more suitable for that role, then so be it. Yet there remained something in his heart, a small voice that whispered he had earned that position through sacrifice and proven ability, a voice he silenced through discipline and focus on the task at hand. As the Great Crusade continued, the Lion led his rebuilt legion on campaigns across the galaxy. He developed a reputation as a frighteningly effective warlord who operated best when given independence to prosecute wars as he saw fit. He was not one for grand councils or strategic debates with his brother Primarchs. He preferred to receive his objectives and then accomplish them through whatever means proved most efficient. This approach won victories, but also reinforced his reputation as cold, secretive, and difficult to work with. His brother Primarchs respected his abilities, but few genuinely liked him. The incident on Dulin exemplified the complications his personality caused. The world was in rebellion, and both the Dark Angels and Space Wolves had been dispatched to bring it into compliance. The planetary governor, Duroth, had insulted Layman Russ, calling him the Emperor's lapdog and swearing to feed Russ's heart to his beasts. Russ, predictably, swore to kill Duroth himself. But when the Space Wolves breached the governor's palace, they found Duroth already dead, slain by the Lion who had taken a more direct route to the target. To the Lion, it was simple logic. Duroth was the enemy. Eliminating the enemy was the objective, therefore he eliminated Duroth. The fact that Russ had sworn to kill the governor personally seemed irrelevant to the mission's success. Russ saw matters differently. To him, the Lion had broken an oath of brotherhood, stealing glory that rightfully belonged to the Space Wolves. The confrontation between the two Primarchs escalated into a legendary duel that lasted for a full day and night. They were evenly matched, neither able to gain decisive advantage, trading blows that would have killed lesser beings. The fight finally ended when both collapsed from exhaustion, and when the Lion recovered consciousness to find Russ laughing at the absurdity of their battle, he struck his brother one final blow, knocking him unconscious. The incident created a rivalry between the Dark Angels and Space Wolves that would persist for 10,000 years, each chapter conducting ritual duels to determine which was superior. Throughout these years, Luther remained on Caliban. Shortly after the Dark Angels joined the Great Crusade, during the campaign against the Sarosh, Luther had discovered a bomb hidden aboard the flagship, a weapon planted by Sarosh infiltrators intended to assassinate the Lion. For a moment, a terrible moment that Luther would remember for the rest of his life, he had hesitated. The jealousy he had suppressed, the resentment at always being second to the Primarch, rose up and whispered that this could be his chance. He could simply walk away, let the bomb detonate, and perhaps in the chaos that followed, he might finally step out of the Lion's shadow. But Luther was not yet lost. His better nature prevailed, and with the help of the librarian Zahariel, he disarmed the device and saved the Lion's life. Yet somehow, the Lion knew. Perhaps he sensed the hesitation. Perhaps Zahariel revealed the truth. Perhaps the Lion simply understood human nature well enough to see what had almost happened. The confrontation between them was private, but its aftermath was public. The Lion ordered Luther, along with several hundred other Dark Angels, predominantly Calibanites, to return to their homeworld. Ostensibly, this was to accelerate recruitment, to transform Caliban into a factory for producing new warriors. But everyone understood the truth. It was exile. Luther would never forget the look in the Lion's eyes during that final conversation, cold and disappointed, the gaze of someone who had expected betrayal and found his expectations fulfilled. The warriors sent back with him felt the shame of it. They had done nothing wrong, but they had been removed from the Crusade, sent to a backwater world while their brothers earned glory among the stars. And slowly, over the decades that followed, that shame would transform into bitterness, and bitterness into rage, and rage into something far darker. On Caliban, Luther proved to be an effective administrator. The recruitment and training programs he established produced thousands of new Dark Angels, replacing the losses from the Rangdan Xenocides and swelling the Legion's ranks. But Caliban itself was changing in disturbing ways. The industrialization required to support Legion operations scarred the once beautiful forests. The great beasts, thought extinct, began to reappear, as if the planet itself was rejecting the changes being imposed upon it. Worse, a cabal of Terran sorcerers infiltrated Caliban, bringing with them the taint of chaos. Luther became aware that the planet harbored deep corruption, that the proximity to the Eye of Terror had left wounds in reality that could never truly heal. Luther's paranoia grew. He became convinced that the Emperor would eventually discover Caliban's corruption and order the planet destroyed. He believed the Lion had deliberately kept this secret from him, that his exile was not punishment for hesitation, but a death sentence. When rebellion erupted among Caliban's nobility, those who resented the changes the Imperium had brought, Luther found himself sympathizing with their grievances.
And when whispers from the warp began offering him power, promising him the strength to save Caliban and to finally prove himself superior to the Primarch who had cast him aside, Luther began to listen. As Luther descended into darkness on Caliban, the Lion found himself embroiled in the greatest crisis the Imperium had ever faced, the Horus heresy. When news reached him that the War Master Horus Lupercal had renounced his oaths to the Emperor and declared war upon the Imperium, the Lion was conducting operations against the Gordian League on the far side of the galaxy. Rather than immediately rushing to Terra, the Lion made a calculated decision. He led a strike force to the Forge World of Diamat, where weapons intended for Horus's rebellion were being manufactured. The Lion secured these weapons, but then made a decision that would haunt him. He traded them to Perturabo, his brother Primarch of the Iron Warriors, in exchange for a promise of support. The Lion believed he was making a political move, securing Perturabo's loyalty to prevent him from joining Horus. Instead, Perturabo had already turned traitor, and the weapons the Lion delivered would be used in the drop site massacre at Istvan V, where loyalist legions were slaughtered by their traitorous brothers. It was a mistake born of the Lion's fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and politics. He had calculated based on logic and strategy, failing to account for the depths of resentment and ambition that drove Perturabo. The error would cost thousands of loyalist lives. But the Lion's greatest challenge during the heresy came not from direct confrontation with major traitor forces, but from a grinding, brutal campaign against one of his brother Primarchs, Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. Horus, understanding the threat the Dark Angels posed, had dispatched Kurz and his Night Lord's Legion to the eastern fringe with orders to keep the Lion far from Terra. The campaign that followed, known as the Thramas Crusade, would last nearly 3 years and devastate both legions. Conrad Kurz was perhaps the most damaged of all the Primarchs. Cursed with visions of a future he could not prevent, driven to madness by the horrors he had witnessed and perpetrated, Kurz waged war through terror and psychological warfare. The Night Lords did not simply conquer worlds, they broke them, leaving populations traumatized and infrastructure destroyed. Against the conventional enemy, their tactics proved devastatingly effective. But the Lion was not a conventional enemy. He understood Kurz's methods, recognized the patterns in the Night Lord's operations, and adapted his strategies accordingly. The campaign opens with Night Lord's victories. They captured key forge worlds in the Thramas sector, denying their industrial output to the Imperium and securing supply lines for traitor forces. They conducted lightning raids against Imperial strongholds, leaving death and terror in their wake. For a year, the Dark Angels chased shadows, arriving at worlds too late to prevent massacres, finding Night Lord's forces melted away before they could be brought to battle. The Lion's frustration grew, but so did his understanding of his enemy. Kurz himself left a deep void beacon in the patrol path of a Dark Angel's outrider vessel, an invitation to parley on the world of Tegualsa. It was both a trap and a genuine attempt at communication. Kurz hoped to sway his brother to Horus's cause, or failing that, to demonstrate the futility of opposing the rebellion. The meeting between the two Primarchs was surreal. Kurz revealed prophecies about the Dark Angel's future, cryptic warnings about the destruction of Caliban and the Fallen. The conversation was almost cordial until Kurz, in his madness, slandered the Lion with accusations of hypocrisy and lies. The Lion struck him down in a blow that many would later describe as dishonorable. beginning a brutal melee between the two Primarchs and their honor guards. The fight ended inconclusively. Kurz slashed the lion's throat, a wound that would have killed a normal human, but merely incapacitated the Primarch for crucial moments. Korzwain, one of the lion's honor guard, drove his sword through Kurz's spine, paralyzing the Night Haunter. Both Primarchs were evacuated by their respective forces, both badly wounded, and the battle for Tsagualsa descended into brutal boarding actions as the fleets clashed above the dying world. The lion's recovery took months, time the Imperium could ill afford. But when he returned to command, he had learned crucial lessons about his enemy. The Night Lords relied on terror, on psychological dominance, on the fear they inspired. The Lion implemented new doctrines across his legion, enhanced mental conditioning to resist fear, aggressive void warfare tactics designed to bring Night Lords' vessels to battle, and a willingness to accept casualties if it meant forcing decisive engagements. Where Kurz sought to avoid direct confrontation, the Lion would force it. Where the Night Lords relied on mobility and surprise, the Dark Angels would create situations where such advantages became irrelevant. The turning point came when the Dark Angels deployed what would later become infamous as the Dreadwing's ultimate sanction. A series of worlds heavily invested with Night Lords' forces were subjected to weapons of mass destruction, atomics, and worse, that sterilized entire planetary populations. The Lion made a calculated decision. If he could not catch the Night Lords in conventional battle, he would destroy their objectives before they could claim them. It was ruthless, arguably cruel, and it worked. The Night Lords found themselves fighting a war of attrition they could not win, losing warriors faster than they could be replaced, watching their supply lines collapse as Forge Worlds burned. In the final months of the Thramas Crusade, the Lion achieved what he had been working towards since the campaign began. Through a combination of intelligence gathered by his Firewing operatives and tactical positioning of his fleet, he forced a decisive engagement in the Thramas system itself. The void battle that followed was one of the largest of the entire heresy. Hundreds of capital ships clashed in orbital space, lance batteries carving through armor plating, boarding torpedoes carrying assault squads into enemy vessels, explosions lighting the darkness like newborn stars. The Lion personally led a boarding action against the Nightfall, the Night Lord's flagship, penetrating deep into the vessel's command sections. His objective was simple: kill Conrad Kurz and break the Night Lords once and for all. But Kurz, even wounded and half-mad, remained dangerous. The duel between the two Primarchs aboard the Nightfall was brief but vicious. Kurz, lacking the strength for prolonged combat, relied on visions of possible futures to anticipate the Lion's attacks. The Lion, in turn, adapted with each exchange, learning his brother's patterns, accepting wounds that allowed him to land devastating counterstrikes. In the end, it was the Lion's endurance that proved decisive. He weathered Kurz's assault, absorbed punishment that would have killed any other being, and systematically broke down his brother's defenses. When the opportunity came, he drove his fist through Kurz's chest cavity, rupturing organs and shattering bone. The Night Haunter fell, bleeding and broken, and would have died had his warriors not extracted him under cover of desperate counterattacks. The Night Lords fled Thramas with their legion shattered, having lost nearly 30% of their fighting strength. The Lion had won, but the victory had cost 3 years that might have made the difference at Terra. As the Lion finally prepared to break free from the Eastern Fringe and race toward Terra, intending to reinforce the defenders against Horus's assault, he received word from Ultramar that changed everything. Robute Guilliman was alive, had survived the ruin storm that had cut off the eastern reaches of the galaxy, and was calling for a gathering of loyalist Primarchs. The Lion, still uncertain about which of his brothers remained loyal, diverted to Macragge to investigate. What he discovered there would test his loyalty and his relationship with his brothers in ways he never anticipated.
Guilliman had done the unthinkable. Unable to reach Terra through the warp storms, uncertain whether the Emperor still lived, the Lord of Ultramar had declared the formation of Imperium Secundus, a secondary imperium with its capital at Macragge. He had gone further, crowning Sanguinius of the Blood Angels as Emperor in his father's place. The Lion arrived to find his brothers had created a new government without his input, had elevated one of their own to their father's throne, and now expected him to swear fealty to this new order. The Lion's reaction was complex. On one level, he understood the logic. With Terra cut off and the Imperium apparently decapitated, establishing continuity of government made strategic sense. But on another level, deeper and more primal, he felt betrayed. These were his brothers, his family, and they had made decisions of cosmic importance without consulting him. Worse, they had elevated Sanguinius rather than him, the firstborn, the prototype, the one who had led his legion through the Rangdan Xenocides when the Imperium's survival hung by a thread. Guilliman attempted to explain his reasoning.
He had not claimed the throne himself because his political enemies would have accused him of opportunism. He had chosen Sanguinius because the angel represented the best of the Imperium's ideals, beloved by all, free from the taint of ambition. The Lion was not chosen because his secretive nature made him too similar to their father, and because, frankly, few would follow someone they could not understand. It was logical, carefully reasoned, and it enraged the Lion more than any insult could have. For a terrible moment, the Imperium Secundus teetered on the edge of civil war within its own borders. The Lion could have rejected Guilliman's creation, could have taken his legion and departed, or worse, could have attempted to seize power for himself. Instead, Sanguinius intervened. The Blood Angel spoke to the Lion privately, brother to brother, and explained that he had not sought this throne, that he would gladly step aside if it would preserve unity. More than that, he offered the Lion the position he was uniquely suited for, Lord Protector of Imperium Secundus, commander of its military forces, the shield that would defend their new realm while they worked to break through to Terra. The Lion accepted, though not with grace. He swore his oaths, acknowledged Sanguinius as emperor, and took up his duties as Lord Protector. But the wound to his pride remained. Throughout his time in Imperium Secundus, he worked tirelessly, reorganizing defenses, hunting down traitor infiltrators, fortifying Ultramar against attack. Yet his relationship with Guilliman grew increasingly strained. Where once there had been professional respect, now there was barely concealed hostility. They argued constantly, the Lion's preference for secrecy and need-to-know operations clashing with Guilliman's desire for transparency and coordinated planning. The conflict came to a head over the Lion's establishment of the Crusade host. This autonomous force, operating independently of Guilliman's command structure, answered only to the Lion himself. It consisted of elements from the Dark Angels, Ultramarines, and Blood Angels, along with various auxiliary forces. Guilliman saw it as the Lion creating his own private army, a potential threat to the unity of Imperium Secundus. The Lion saw it as a necessary tool for conducting operations that required secrecy and deniability. Their arguments on this topic grew heated enough that Sanguinius had to mediate. During this period, the Lion also contended with the presence of Conrad Kurz on Macragge. The Night Haunter had been captured and was being held prisoner, but his presence was a cancer in the heart of Imperium Secundus. Kurz sowed dissent through whispered prophecies, exploited divisions between the loyalist Primarchs, and conducted a terror campaign from within his cell that claimed hundreds of lives. The Lion advocated repeatedly for Kurz's immediate execution, arguing that keeping him alive served no purpose and endangered everyone. But Sanguinius, ever merciful, refused to execute their brother without trial, and Guilliman supported him, believing that justice must be maintained even in wartime. The Lion's frustration with this decision nearly drove him to act unilaterally. He came close to entering Kurz's cell and ending the matter himself, oaths and propriety be damned. What stopped him was not respect for his brother's authority, but the knowledge that such an act would shatter what little unity remained between the loyalist Primarchs. He forced himself to wait, to endure Kur's presence, though every instinct screamed at him to eliminate this threat. When Kurz eventually escaped and the lion led the hunt to recapture him, there was a grim satisfaction in finally being allowed to act. The hunt for Kurz through the underhive of Macragge was a descent into nightmare. The Night Haunter had transformed sections of the city into his personal domain, creating a labyrinth of terror where he held every advantage. The lion led his warriors into that darkness, accepting casualties that horrified even hardened Dark Angels, because capturing Kurz meant denying Horus a powerful weapon. The final confrontation came in the ruins of what had once been a noble district, now transformed into a charnel house. The lion and Kurz fought among the dead, two Primarchs locked in savage combat, neither giving quarter. This time, the lion fought with a cold fury that even Kurz's visions could not fully predict. He had learned from their previous encounters, understood his brother's patterns, and, more importantly, no longer cared about honor or dignity. He fought to win, using every dirty trick, every brutal technique, every advantage he could create. When Kurz tried to goad him with prophecies about the fallen, the lion shut out the words and focused on the simple reality of fist and blade. He beat his brother into submission through sheer determination, a Primarch's resilience pushed to its absolute limit. With Kurz recaptured and secured, the purpose of Imperium Nihilus came into question. The ruin storm was weakening, and astropathic messages suggested that Terra still stood, that the Emperor still lived. The three Primarchs realized that their secondary Imperium had served its purpose, but was no longer needed. They dissolved it, acknowledging that there could be only one true Imperium, and prepared to make the journey to Terra. But even as they planned their departure, tensions remained high. The lion had proven his loyalty and his worth as Lord Protector, but his relationships with Guilliman and even Sanguinus had been damaged in ways that might never fully heal. The journey to Terra proved nightmarish. The ruin storm, though weakening, remained a barrier that shredded ships and drove navigators mad. Of the vast fleet that departed Ultimar, only a fraction arrived at Terra, and they arrived too late. The siege was over. Horus was dead. The Emperor was entombed upon the Golden Throne. Sanguinus, the beloved angel, had fallen in battle. The Imperium had survived, but at a cost almost too terrible to comprehend. The lion walked the ruins of the Imperial Palace, witnessing the devastation, the billions dead, the civilization scarred perhaps beyond recovery. His role in delaying at Imperium Secundus, however justified, weighed upon him. But the lion had no time to mourn or contemplate his failures. Reports reached him of rebellion on Caliban. Luther had declared independence from the Imperium, had corrupted nearly half the Dark Angels stationed on the homeworld, and had transformed the planet into a fortress against the Imperium's vengeance. The lion felt the news like a physical blow. Throughout the heresy, he had trusted that Caliban remained loyal, that Luther, despite his exile, would never betray their brotherhood. To learn that his oldest friend had turned traitor, that the world he had saved from the great beasts had fallen to chaos, was perhaps the cruelest revelation of all. The lion gathered what remained of his legion and made for Caliban with all possible speed. The journey gave him time to contemplate what had happened. He understood now that Luther's betrayal was not sudden but gradual, the culmination of decades of resentment and jealousy. He understood that his own actions, exiling Luther rather than addressing the problem directly, had contributed to this tragedy. But understanding did not mean forgiveness. Luther had betrayed not just the lion, but the Imperium, the Emperor, everything they had fought to build. For that, there could be no mercy. The fleet arrived in orbit around Caliban to find the planet heavily fortified.
The orbital defense platforms, built to protect against external threats, had been turned against the arriving loyalists. The Invincible Reason and its accompanying vessels took heavy fire as they pushed toward the planet. Rather than conduct a prolonged orbital campaign, the Lion opted for direct action. He led a Terminator assault directly to the surface, teleporting into the heart of the Order's fortress monastery where Luther had established his stronghold. The battle for Caliban was unlike anything the Dark Angels had experienced. They were fighting their own brothers, warriors who knew their tactics, who had trained alongside them, who shared their genetic legacy. The fallen angels, as they would come to be known, fought with desperate ferocity. They knew that defeat meant death or worse, and they sold their lives dearly. The fortress monastery became a labyrinth of death, every corridor contested, every chamber soaked in blood. Dark angels killed dark angels, brothers slaughtered brothers, and above it all hung the sick, twisted presence of chaos corruption. The Lion fought his way through the fortress, his warriors forming a spearhead that drove toward Luther's sanctum. He encountered many he had once called friend, warriors he had elevated from the knightly orders of Caliban, men who should have been the finest of his legion. Now they were corrupted, their armor bearing the marks of chaos, their eyes holding the feverish light of madness. He killed them without hesitation, because that was what duty demanded. But each death carved a wound in his heart that would never heal. When the Lion finally reached Luther's sanctum, he found his old mentor transformed. The man who had discovered him in the forest, who had given him his name and taught him the ways of civilization, was gone.
In his place stood something terrible. Luther had allowed himself to be possessed by the powers of chaos, his body swollen with unnatural strength, his features twisted beyond recognition. Yet his voice, when he spoke, remained hauntingly familiar. He spoke of betrayal and abandonment, of being cast aside while lesser men earned glory, of the corruption that had always lurked in Caliban's heart, and how the Lion had ignored it. The Lion listened to these accusations in silence, his face a mask of stone. When Luther finished, the Lion spoke a single sentence: "You are no longer my brother." Then he attacked. The duel between Lion L. Johnson and Luther was not a contest of equals. Luther, empowered by chaos, wielded strength that matched the Primarch's, wielded sorcery that could rend reality itself. But the Lion was the Emperor's firstborn, a being crafted to be the ultimate warrior. He weathered Luther's assault, his armor cracking, his body taking wounds that would have killed any lesser being. The battle raged through the sanctum and beyond, the two warriors smashing through walls, their clashes generating shockwaves that brought down entire sections of the fortress. Around them, Caliban itself began to die. The planet's proximity to the Eye of Terror, combined with the massive warp energies being unleashed in the duel, created catastrophic instabilities. Warp storms materialized in the atmosphere, tearing at the world's surface. The very bedrock began to fracture, ancient fault lines awakening as if the planet itself was screaming. Neither combatant noticed the destruction around them. They were locked in their private war, all the accumulated resentment and betrayal of decades finding expression in blade and bolt. The Lion drove Luther back, step by step, accepting wounds to land killing blows. He was the better warrior, always had been, and even empowered by the ruinous powers, Luther could not overcome that fundamental truth. But Luther had one final advantage. He was willing to do anything to win. As the Lion closed for the killing blow, Luther unleashed a psychic attack of devastating power. He channeled every ounce of energy the dark gods would grant him, creating a psychic maelstrom that struck the Lion like a physical blow. The Primarch's armor shattered, his body was lifted and hurled across the sanctum, smashing into a wall with force enough to crack the stone. The Lion fell, gravely wounded, perhaps dying, and lay motionless on the blood-soaked floor. Luther stood over his fallen opponents, preparing to deliver the final blow. But something broke within him at that moment. Looking down at the lion, seeing what he had done to the boy he had rescued from the forest, the warrior he had trained, the brother he had loved, Luther's mind snapped. The possession faded as the chaos gods withdrew their power, disgusted by his sudden weakness. Luther collapsed beside the lion, weeping, his sanity shattered by the full realization of what he had done and what he had become. At that moment, a psychic shockwave rippled across Caliban.
It carried the fury of the Emperor himself, channeled through the Astronomicon, a final punishment for the traitors who had wounded his firstborn son. The planet's destruction accelerated catastrophically. The surface shattered, continents broke apart and were cast into space. The atmosphere ignited in a firestorm visible from orbit. Of mighty Caliban, only a single fragment survived, the fortress monastery itself, protected by ancient void shields and the lingering power of archaic technologies buried in its foundations. This fragment, torn from its parent world and cast into the warp, would come to be known as the Rock. It became the new home of the Dark Angels, a mobile fortress monastery that would travel the galaxy for 10,000 years. But when the surviving Dark Angels searched the ruins for their Primarch, they found only Luther, catatonic and broken. The lion had vanished. Whether he had been cast into the warp by the planet's destruction, whether he had died and his body been disintegrated, or whether something else had occurred, none could say. The Dark Angels who survived the destruction of Caliban found themselves facing a crisis of identity and purpose. Their homeworld was gone, their Primarch lost, and worst of all, nearly half their legion had turned traitor. More than that, these traitors had not been killed or contained. When Caliban shattered, the warp storm scattered the fallen across time and space. Some were cast into the distant future, others into the past. Some materialized on distant worlds, others aboard derelict vessels drifting through the void. The fallen remained alive, a constant reminder of the Dark Angel's shame. The decision made by the surviving leaders of the Legion, by Grandmaster Astelin, by Corswain, and others, was one that would define the chapter for millennia. They would keep the existence of the fallen secret. The wider Imperium would believe that Caliban's destruction was a tragic accident, perhaps caused by a meteor strike or internal instability. Only the Dark Angels themselves would know the truth, that their legion had harbored traitors, that their homeworld had fallen to chaos, that their Primarch had disappeared fighting his own corrupted sons. This secret became an obsession. The Dark Angels reorganized themselves around the hunt for the fallen. The Deathwing and Ravenwing, once simply specialized formations, became chambers of secrets. Their warriors inducted into progressively deeper levels of truth about what had happened. Ordinary battle brothers knew nothing, believing the official story. Veterans learned fragments, earning the right to share in the burden of knowledge through proven loyalty. Only the inner circle, the chapter masters and interrogator chaplains who stood at the pinnacle of the organization, knew the complete truth. The hunt for the fallen drove the Dark Angels to extremes that would horrify even other Space Marines. When intelligence suggested a fallen angel's presence on a world, the Dark Angels would deploy in strength, conducting operations in absolute secrecy. If Imperial Guard forces witnessed the capture of a fallen, those witnesses disappeared. If other Space Marine chapters interfered in the hunt, the Dark Angels deflected, misdirected, or in extreme cases, eliminated those who might uncover their secret. They became paranoid, secretive to a fault, trusting no one outside their own chapter and its successors. Over 10,000 years, the hunt continued. Fallen were captured, one by one, and brought to the Rock.
There, in the darkest dungeons of that ancient fortress, interrogator chaplains worked to extract confessions, to make the fallen repent their betrayal. Those who confessed and accepted the emperor's mercy were given the emperor's peace, a quick death that expunged their sin. Those who refused to repent languished in the dungeons, subjected to ever more extreme measures in the hope of eventual redemption. And through it all, Luther remained imprisoned in the deepest cell, kept alive by his chaos-granted vitality, occasionally raving about visions of the lion's return. But while the dark angels hunted their fallen brothers, the lion himself lay elsewhere. Deep within the rock, in a chamber hidden even from the inner circle, the Primarch slept. He had not died on Caliban, but had been placed in stasis by the Watchers in the Dark, mysterious robed figures who had dwelt on Caliban since before humanity arrived. These beings, whose nature and purpose remained unknown, had observed the lion since his earliest days in the forest. When he fell before Luther's psychic assault, they had intervened, spiriting his body away to a hidden chamber where he might heal. The lion's wounds were grievous, inflicted by a psychic attack channeled through chaos energies. His body healed slowly, far more slowly than a Primarch's physiology would normally allow. Decades passed, then centuries, then millennia. The lion slumbered on, unaware of the Imperium's descent into religious fanaticism, unaware of the long war that his surviving sons fought against the fallen, unaware that he had become a legend, a myth, a figure of prophecy rather than history. The Watchers in the Dark maintained their vigil, waiting for the day when the lion would be needed once more. That day came 10,000 years after the heresy, in the era designated M42 by imperial reckoning. The Imperium stood on the brink of destruction. Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, had launched his 13th Black Crusade and succeeded in tearing a massive warp rift across the galaxy. The Cyclotrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, split the Imperium in two, cutting off entire segmentums from Terra and causing demon incursions on a scale not seen since the heresy itself. Robot Guilliman had awakened from his own stasis, taking up the mantle of Lord Commander once more, but even he struggled against the overwhelming tide of chaos. Within the rock, something changed. The psychic turbulence caused by the Great Rift's opening penetrated even the hidden stasis chamber. The lion stirred for the first time in 10 millennia. His eyes opened, and for a moment he was confused, disoriented, unsure where or when he was. The Watchers in the Dark gathered around him, their strange eyes gleaming in the darkness. They did not speak, never had, but somehow the lion understood. He had slept. The Imperium had survived without him, and now he was needed once more. But the lion's awakening was incomplete. His memories were fragmented, scenes from his life arriving in jumbled order. He remembered the forests of Caliban, but could not remember the names of the beasts he had hunted. He remembered his father's face, but could not recall their last conversation. He remembered Luther's betrayal, but could not remember why it had happened. The Watchers led him from the stasis chamber, guiding him through corridors he did not recognize in a fortress he should have known. His own chapter, busy with their missions and their secrets, remained unaware of his presence. The Watchers in the Dark guided the lion to a chamber where a portal awaited, an ancient gateway that predated human habitation of Caliban. The lion felt drawn to it, compelled by instincts he could not fully articulate. He stepped through and emerged into a forest. Not any forest, but Caliban's forests as they had been before the great beasts were hunted to extinction, before industrialization scarred the landscape, before humanity had ever set foot on the world. This was impossible, he knew. Caliban was destroyed. Yet here he stood, surrounded by ancient trees, breathing air that smelled of earth and living things. This was not truly Caliban, though it resembled that world so closely. It existed somewhere in the warp,
a reflection of Caliban preserved by forces beyond the lion's understanding. The Watchers in the Dark had connections to this place, had perhaps created it, or discovered it, or been bound to it since time immemorial. Here, the lion could recover in safety, could allow his fragmented mind to heal in the environment where he had first learned what it meant to be alive. The forest welcomed him, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the lion walked beneath the canopy as he had in his youth. The healing process was gradual and strange. The lion found himself reliving experiences from his past, but from different perspectives. He saw himself as others had seen him, cold, distant, unknowable. He witnessed moments he had forgotten, conversations with his sons where his words had wounded, though he had not intended harm. He saw Luther's slow descent into jealousy and madness, understood for the first time the pain his old mentor had suffered. The forest showed him truths he had been unable or unwilling to face during his life, and slowly, painfully, the lion began to understand not just what had happened, but why. Time moved strangely in this place. Days might have passed, or years, or decades. The lion did not age, did not hunger, did not tire. He simply existed, walking the endless forests, contemplating the lessons they offered. He hunted, not because he needed to, but because hunting focused his mind, allowed him to process what he was learning.
The beasts he stalked were not real in the conventional sense, but manifestations of concepts made flesh. He tracked fear through the darkest groves and learned courage. He stalked pride through sunlit glades and learned humility. He pursued duty into the deepest caves and learned mercy. When the lion finally emerged from the forest, his mind was whole once more. His memories had returned, not just the facts, but the emotional context that gave them meaning. He understood himself in ways he never had during his previous life. More than that, he understood humanity in ways that had always eluded him. The cold, calculating warrior who had seen people as assets to be deployed remained, but alongside him existed something new: empathy, the ability to truly comprehend the hopes and fears that drove mortal beings. The lion had become more than he was, not through power, but through understanding. He did not return to the rock immediately. Instead, the lion began to wander, emerging from the warp in different locations across the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the Imperium cut off by the Great Rift. He traveled alone, or perhaps accompanied by a single watcher in the dark, its small robed form a constant presence. He witnessed the Imperium's condition firsthand, not through strategic briefings, but through walking among the people his father had sought to protect. What he saw appalled him. The Imperium his father had built was gone, replaced by something the Emperor would have despised. Religion dominated every aspect of life. The imperial cult worshipping the Emperor as a god, despite his clear and repeated rejection of divinity. The administratum had become so bloated with bureaucracy that worlds could die waiting for aid that was lost in paperwork. The Inquisition wielded terrifying power with minimal oversight, purging entire populations on suspicion of corruption. And everywhere, humanity suffered under the weight of systems that had been designed to protect but had become engines of oppression. Yet the lion also saw courage and determination that moved him in ways he had never expected. He witnessed Imperial Guard soldiers, knowing they were going to die, holding positions so that civilians could evacuate. He saw preachers offering comfort to the dying, their faith genuine, even if the lion found the theology flawed. He encountered Adepta Sororitas cleansing daemon incursions with holy fire, their fanaticism distasteful, but their effectiveness undeniable. The Imperium was broken, corrupted, a grotesque parody of his father's dream, but it endured. And the people who comprised it deserved better than they had received. During these wanderings, the lion began to intervene. At first, subtly,
providing intelligence to beleaguered defenders, sabotaging chaos rituals before they could complete, leading lost refugees to safety. But gradually, he became more direct. On the Forge world of Avalim's, when Chaos forces breached the last defensive perimeter, a lone warrior in ancient armor appeared and turned the tide, killing a greater demon in single combat before vanishing.
On the Hive world of Crusade, a mysterious figure rallied broken Imperial forces and led them in a counterattack that reclaimed their capital from heretic forces. Reports began to circulate of a golden-haired warrior of impossible prowess who appeared when hope seemed lost, fought with the fury of the Emperor's own vengeance, and departed before any could learn his identity. The Lion remained anonymous during these interventions because he was not yet ready to reveal himself. He understood that his return would have profound implications for the Imperium. Questions would be asked about where he had been, why he had not returned sooner, what had happened on Caliban. The Dark Angels would be forced to confront truths they had spent 10,000 years concealing. More than that, his return would alter the balance of power at the highest levels of Imperial command. Robute Guilliman had assumed control, reorganizing the Imperium according to his vision. The Lion's reappearance would create complications, rivalries, potential conflicts at a time when unity was desperately needed. But the Lion could not remain hidden forever. Events were building toward a crisis that would require his direct involvement. Vashtor, the Archaphane, a powerful demon that represented the Forge and the Factory, had begun a campaign to ascend to become a fifth Chaos God. His plan involved corrupting a lost relic of unimaginable power, a fragment of the ancient Dark Age of technology. If Vashtor succeeded, the balance between the Chaos Gods would shatter, potentially creating a new warp entity with the power to overwhelm the Materium entirely. The Lion learned of this plot through his wanderings. He encountered cultists preparing ritual sites, intercepted communications between traitor forces coordinating their operations, pieced together the fragments of Vashtor's grand design. What troubled him most was the involvement of his own gene sons. Some among the fallen had allied with Vashtor, offering their services to the demon in exchange for power and position in whatever new order emerged. The Lion realized he could no longer remain in the shadows. The threat was too great, and the Dark Angels would need their Primarch if they were to prevail. The Lion's public return occurred at the world of Wormwood, a critical junction in the Imperium Nihilus. Chaos forces had laid siege to the planet, seeking to capture it as a staging ground for deeper incursions. The defenders were losing, slowly but inevitably being ground down by superior numbers and demonic support. The Dark Angels chapter, along with several successor chapters, had deployed to relieve Wormwood, but found themselves unable to break through the siege lines. It was here that the Lion chose to reveal himself. The battle for Wormwood had reached its most desperate hour when the Lion appeared on the battlefield. He came not with fanfare or announcement, but simply emerged from the smoke and carnage, the sword of the Lion blazing with power in his hands. The Dark Angels who witnessed his arrival at first could not believe what they were seeing. Their Primarch, dead for 10,000 years, stood before them. Some fell to their knees in shock. Others thought they were witnessing a vision or a trick of chaos. But when the Lion began to fight, cutting through demon packs with contemptuous ease, slaying chaos champions who had terrorized entire systems, they understood that this was real. Supreme Grand Master Azrael, leader of the Dark Angels chapter, recognized the implications immediately. The Lion's return validated everything the Inner Circle had believed for 10 millennia. Their Primarch lived. But his return also meant that secrets would be revealed, that the truth about Caliban and the Fallen could no longer be contained. Azrael made his way to the Lion through the chaos of battle, ready to kneel before his Primarch and accept whatever judgment came. What he found was not the cold, distant figure of legend, but someone who seemed to understand the weight Azrael and his predecessors had carried. The conversation between Azrael and the lion was private, but its results became immediately apparent. The lion took direct command of all Dark Angel's forces at Wormwood, reorganizing their disposition with the same tactical brilliance that had characterized his campaigns during the Great Crusade. More than that, he led from the front, his presence inspiring feats of valor from warriors who had already pushed themselves beyond their limits. Within 6 hours of his arrival, the tide of battle had turned. Within a day, the Chaos forces were in retreat. Within 3 days, Wormwood was secure, and the lion had proven beyond any doubt that he was who he claimed to be. But securing Wormwood was merely the first step. The lion understood that Vastor's plot extended far beyond a single world. He gathered his commanders, both from the Dark Angels and their successor chapters, and revealed what he had learned during his time in the shadows. Vastor was seeking the key, an ancient artifact of terrible power. The demon had already gathered most of the components needed to create this key, and once completed, it would allow him to access places even the Chaos gods could not reach, to claim powers that would elevate him to godhood. The Imperium had only one chance to stop this: find Vastor's Forge Citadel and destroy it before the ritual could be completed. The campaign that followed tested the lion in ways even the Rangdan Xenocides had not. This was not a conventional war where superior tactics and determination could guarantee victory. They faced an enemy that could reshape reality, that drew power from the warp itself, that commanded legions of demons and corrupted Astartes. The lion led his forces on a running campaign through the most chaos-tainted regions of the Imperium Nihilus, fighting battles on demon worlds where physical laws held no meaning, boarding space hulks infested with horrors beyond description, conducting assassination strikes against key demon princes and chaos champions who served Vastor's cause. Throughout this campaign, the lion demonstrated that he had changed from the Primarch who had fought during the heresy. He still possessed the same tactical genius, the same superhuman prowess in combat, the same unwavering determination. But now he also showed understanding of his warrior's limitations, compassion when circumstances allowed, and a willingness to explain his reasoning rather than simply issuing orders. Veterans who had fought for centuries noticed the difference. Their Primarch had not merely returned, he had grown beyond what he had been. The lion also began to address the matter of the fallen during this campaign. He encountered several of these corrupted brothers in battle, and his response varied depending on circumstances. Some were so deeply corrupted by chaos that they were beyond redemption. These he killed without hesitation, granting them the merciful death they no longer deserved. But others, those who had been cast through time and who bore only the psychological taint of Luther's rebellion rather than direct corruption, he offered a different path. He gave them the choice to repent, to serve once more, to earn redemption through deed rather than simply confessing in a cell. This approach horrified some members of the Inner Circle who had spent 10,000 years believing that all fallen must be captured, interrogated, and eliminated. But the lion made clear that he was not asking for their opinion. He was their Primarch, and the decision regarding how to deal with traitors from his own legion belonged to him alone. Some of the fallen accepted his offer, swearing new oaths and joining the campaign against Vastor. Others rejected him, spitting curses even as he struck them down. And still others simply chose death, unable to bear the weight of their guilt regardless of whether forgiveness was offered. The final confrontation with Vastor came at the Daemon's Forge Citadel, a structure that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp. To reach it required navigating through the most turbulent region of the Cicatrix Maledictum, where normal laws of reality broke down entirely.
The lion led a strike force of his finest warriors, including elements of the Deathwing and Ravenwing, supported by contingents from successor chapters who had proven themselves during the campaign. They fought their way into the citadel through waves of daemon engines and corrupted war machines, each step forward purchased with blood and sacrifice. Within the citadel's heart, they found Vastor in the midst of his ascension ritual. The daemon had completed the key and was using it to tear open a passage to realities beyond even the warp, seeking to claim the ultimate prize, the technology and knowledge that would allow him to rival the chaos gods themselves. The ritual chamber defied description, existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, filled with machinery that hurt to perceive and energies that burn the soul to witness. The lion did not hesitate. He charged directly at Vastor, his sword blazing with power, his warriors following despite the madness that threatened to overwhelm them. The battle between Lion L. Johnson and Vastor was not simply physical combat, but a contest of wills that resonated through the warp. Vastor wielded powers that could unmake reality, weapons forged from captured souls, daemon stuff given terrible form. The lion countered with nothing but his blade, his skill, and his absolute refusal to yield. He had fought greater daemons before, had faced powers beyond mortal comprehension. This was simply another enemy to be destroyed, another obstacle between him and his objective. Around them, Dark Angel's warriors fought to disrupt the ritual, destroying components of the key, severing power conduits, killing the corrupted priests who maintained the ceremony. Vastor, realizing his ascension was failing, focused entirely on destroying the lion, hoping that without the Primarch's leadership, the assault would collapse. The daemon unleashed everything in its arsenal, reality-warping technologies that could age a target to dust, weapons that killed by erasing the victim from causality itself, psychic attacks that drove mortals mad through sheer conceptual horror. The lion weathered it all. His armor cracked, his body took wounds that would have killed any other being. His mind endured assaults that would have shattered even an Astartes. But he did not stop, did not slow, did not yield even a single step. He drove forward through the maelstrom, each stride bringing him closer to his target, each blow of his sword cutting away another layer of Vastor's protections. When he finally reached the daemon, the lion did not waste time with words or theatrical gestures. He simply struck, driving his blade into the heart of the ritual, shattering the key and banishing Vastor back into the warp. The citadel's collapse was catastrophic. With the ritual broken and Vastor banished, the structure's existence became unstable. Reality reasserted itself with devastating force, tearing apart the impossible architecture, casting daemon engines back into the warp from which they had been summoned. The lion led his surviving warriors in a desperate fighting retreat, racing to reach their extraction point before the entire citadel was destroyed. Not all made it. Hundreds of Dark Angels fell in the final retreat, holding positions so that their brothers could escape, accepting death with the knowledge that they had prevented something terrible. When the survivors finally emerged from the warp and returned to real space, they found the Imperium Nihilus in chaos but not yet fallen. Vastor's defeat had disrupted chaos operations across entire sectors, buying the Imperium time and space to consolidate its defenses. The lion's return had given hope to millions who had believed themselves abandoned by the Emperor. But more than that, his return had demonstrated that the Imperium's greatest heroes were not merely legends. The Primarchs could return, could fight once more for humanity's survival, and perhaps the Imperium might find a way to endure. Yet the lion's mission was far from complete. With Vastor defeated, he turned his attention to the broader strategic situation. The Imperium Nihilus remained cut off from Terra, isolated by the Great Rift and under constant assault from Chaos forces. The region needed leadership, needed a strategy beyond simply reacting to each new threat. The lion's return had given hope to millions who had believed themselves abandoned by the Emperor. But more than that, His return had demonstrated that the Imperium's greatest heroes were not merely legends. The Primarchs could return, could fight once more for humanity's survival, and perhaps, the Imperium might find a way to endure. Yet the Lion's mission was far from complete. With Vostor defeated, he turned his attention to the broader strategic situation. The Imperium Nihilus remained cut off from Terra, isolated by the Great Rift and under constant assault from Chaos forces. The region needed leadership, needed a strategy beyond simply reacting to each new threat.
The Lion, drawing on his experience from the Great Crusade, began to implement a comprehensive defensive strategy. He established strong points at key locations, organized supply lines to ensure that loyal worlds could support each other, created rapid response forces capable of reinforcing threatened sectors. But the Lion also recognized that he could not simply impose his will on the Imperium as he might have during the Great Crusade. 10,000 years had changed the Imperium fundamentally. The Space Marine chapters were no longer legions answering to a single Primarch's command. They were independent organizations bound by the Codex Astartes and their own traditions. The Imperial Guard answered to their own command structure. The Adeptus Mechanicus pursued its own agenda. The Inquisition operated with frightening autonomy. To be effective, the Lion needed to work within these systems, even as he sought to reform them. His first major political action was reaching out to Robote Guilliman. The relationship between the two Primarchs had always been complicated, marked by fundamental philosophical differences and the tensions of Imperium Secundus. The Lion sent astropathic messages across the Great Rift, informing his brother of his return and his actions. Guilliman's response, when it finally arrived after months of travel through the warp, was cautiously welcoming. The Lord Commander recognized that another Primarch would alter the power dynamics of the Imperium significantly, but he also understood that they needed every advantage they could secure. The first direct communication between the two Primarchs since the heresy was conducted via astropathic relay, a frustrating medium that allowed only the most basic exchange of information. Guilliman wanted the Lion to cross the Great Rift and join him in reorganizing the Imperium proper. The Lion refused, arguing that the Imperium Nihilus needed his presence more urgently. Guilliman pressed, suggesting that the Lion's expertise would be more valuable in the broader strategic planning taking place on Terra. The Lion countered that he had spent 10,000 years dead and was not going to waste his return sitting in planning sessions when he could be fighting the Emperor's enemies directly. The exchange highlighted the differences in their approaches. Guilliman was the administrator, the organizer, the builder of systems. The Lion was the warrior, the hunter, the destroyer of threats. Neither approach was wrong, but they were fundamentally different, and integrating them would require both Primarchs to compromise in ways that did not come naturally to either. Eventually, they agreed to divide responsibilities. Guilliman would focus on the Imperium proper, working to reform its institutions and prepare for the long war ahead. The Lion would command operations in the Imperium Nihilus, prosecuting an aggressive campaign against Chaos forces and securing humanity's holdings in the dark half of the galaxy. This arrangement suited the Lion's temperament perfectly. Free from the political maneuvering and bureaucratic complications that dominated life in the Imperium proper, he could focus on what he did best, making war against the Emperor's enemies. He gathered forces from the Dark Angels and their successor chapters, recruited Imperial Guard regiments who had proven themselves in battle, secured support from Forge worlds that saw the value in backing a Primarch. Within months, he had assembled a substantial military force, though nothing like the legion he had once commanded. The campaigns the Lion prosecuted across the Imperium Nihilus earned him a new title among its inhabitants, the Protector. Where Guilliman was the Lord Commander who reorganized and systematized, the Lion was the shield that stood between humanity and the darkness.
He led his forces in campaigns that ranged from massive set-piece battles involving millions of combatants to small unit actions where a handful of Astartes made the difference between survival and annihilation. His tactical genius, honed over centuries of warfare during the Great Crusade, proved as relevant in the 42nd millennium as it had been 10,000 years earlier. But the Lion also faced challenges that would have been inconceivable during the Great Crusade. The Imperium he served was no longer the rising civilization his father had envisioned, but a decaying empire clinging desperately to survival. Resources were scarce, communications unreliable, and every victory came at a cost that could barely be afforded. The Lion found himself making decisions that his younger self would have found incomprehensible, abandoning worlds to their fate because defending them would cost more than they were worth, accepting outcomes that fell short of total victory because total victory was no longer achievable. These compromises troubled him deeply. The Lion had been created to be perfect, to achieve absolute victory through superior tactics and overwhelming force. Accepting anything less felt like failure, like betraying the principles his father had instilled in him. Yet he learned, slowly and painfully, that in the grim darkness of the 42nd millennium, survival itself constituted victory. Humanity no longer fought to conquer the galaxy, but simply to endure, and any day that ended with the Imperium still standing was a day worth celebrating. Throughout his campaigns, the Lion continued to grapple with the issue of the fallen. Luther remained imprisoned on the rock, guarded by watchers in the dark, and denied contact with anyone except the most senior members of the inner circle. The Lion visited his old mentor once, descending into the depths of the rock to confront the man who had given him his name and then betrayed everything they had built together. What passed between them in that cell remains unknown. No recording devices were permitted, no observers allowed. The Lion emerged hours later with his face a mask of stone, refusing to discuss what had been said. However, the Lion did make one significant policy change regarding the fallen. He declared that those who had been scattered through time without directly serving chaos, who had simply found themselves on the losing side of a civil war through no choice of their own, deserved the opportunity for redemption. This caused significant controversy within the Dark Angels and their successor chapters.
Some embraced the change, recognizing that the 10,000-year hunt had consumed their chapter's purpose, transforming them from the Emperor's warriors into obsessed hunters of their own brothers. Others rejected it, arguing that any compromise with the fallen dishonored those who had died fighting Luther's rebellion. The debate over the fallen highlighted a deeper truth about the Lion's return. He was no longer merely the Primarch of a single legion, but a figure whose decisions would impact the entire Imperium. His word carried weight that transcended military command, influencing policy, shaping doctrine, affecting how billions of humans understood the Emperor's will. This was a responsibility the Lion had never sought and did not particularly want, but it was inescapable. He was a demigod walking among mortals, and everything he did had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Lion also had to confront the religious transformation of the Imperium. The Emperor, who had fought to establish a rational, secular society, was now worshipped as the God Emperor of mankind. The imperial cult dominated every aspect of life, its doctrines enforced by the ecclesiarchy and defended by the zealous warriors of the Adepta Sororitas. As one of the Emperor's sons, someone who had known the Master of Mankind personally, the Lion understood better than most how much his father would have despised this development. Yet, the Lion found himself in an impossible position. The imperial cult, whatever its theological inaccuracies, provided stability to the Imperium. It gave billions of humans a reason to endure lives of unending suffering. It unified disparate populations under a common belief system. It empowered the Adeptus Sororitas, the Adeptus Ministorum, and countless other organizations that served critical functions in the Imperium's defense. To openly oppose the cult would cause schisms that the Imperium could not afford. To embrace it would betray his father's memory and vision. The Lion's solution was characteristic. He ignored the question entirely. When priests approached him seeking theological guidance, he redirected them to more appropriate authorities. When the faithful prostrated themselves before him, he ordered them to rise and get back to their duties. When asked whether the emperor was truly a god, the Lion responded that he was the emperor, and that was all anyone needed to know. It was evasion rather than resolution, but it allowed him to function within the Imperium's religious framework without endorsing or condemning it. As the Lion prosecuted his campaigns across the Imperium Nihilus, he began to assemble something that resembled the command structure he had known during the Great Crusade. Not a legion in the formal sense, the Codex Astartes and 10,000 years of tradition made that impossible, but a coalition of forces that answered to his strategic direction, if not his direct command. Dark Angels and their successors formed the core, but he also secured commitments from other chapters, recruited Imperial Guard armies, negotiated support agreements with Forge Worlds and Night Houses. This coalition, though impressive by the standards of M42, was a shadow of what the Lion had once commanded.
During the Great Crusade, he had led over 100,000 Astartes warriors, supported by millions of Imperial army troops, backed by the full industrial might of Mars. Now he commanded perhaps 10,000 Space Marines scattered across dozens of chapters, supported by whatever guard regiments could be spared from other theaters, relying on Forge Worlds that could barely maintain their own equipment. The contrast between then and now was stark, and it highlighted just how far the Imperium had fallen. Yet the Lion made do with what he had. He divided his forces into multiple strike groups, each capable of independent operations, but coordinated through a central command structure aboard the Invincible Reason. He implemented aggressive patrol patterns that maximized coverage while minimizing response times. He established intelligence networks to identify threats before they could fully develop. He worked with navigators to find stable warp routes through the Cicatrix Maledictum's turbulence. Slowly, methodically, he brought order to a region that had known only chaos since the Great Rift's opening. The Lion's relationship with the Adeptus Custodes proved particularly interesting. These golden-armored warriors, created to be the Emperor's personal guard, had expanded their role after the heresy, deploying beyond Terra to combat threats across the galaxy. Small forces of custodians operated throughout the Imperium Nihilus, conducting their own operations according to their own strategic calculus. When they encountered the Lion, their initial reaction was wariness. 10,000 years had taught the Custodes to trust no one completely, not even a returned Primarch. The Lion understood their suspicion and made no attempt to command them. Instead, he proposed coordination where their objectives aligned. When Custodes and Dark Angels forces found themselves operating in the same theater, they shared intelligence and supported each other's operations without formal integration. This arrangement worked because the Lion respected the Custodes' independence while they respected his tactical acumen. Over time, a relationship of professional respect developed, and the Custodes became increasingly willing to act on the Lion's intelligence and advice, even if they never formally subordinated themselves to his authority. Among the most significant of the Lion's campaigns in the period following his return was the Second Siege of Sotha. This world, once the site of a major ultramarine stronghold, had fallen to Alpha Legion infiltrators who sought to corrupt its powerful beacon technology for chaos purposes. The Lion led a combined force of Dark Angels, Ultramarine successors, and Imperial Guard in an assault that became legendary for its complexity.
The Alpha Legion, masters of deception and infiltration, had turned the entire world into one vast trap. Every defensive position a trick, every apparent weakness actually a killing ground. Against an enemy that excelled at deception, the Lion proved the value of overwhelming, straightforward force. Rather than attempting to outthink the Alpha Legion's elaborate schemes, he simply brought sufficient power to make those schemes irrelevant.
He bombarded suspected strongpoints from orbit until they ceased to exist, advanced behind walls of armored vehicles that absorbed ambushes, employed librarians to detect psychic manipulation, and accepted casualties that would have made most commanders hesitate. The Alpha Legion's carefully constructed defenses were simply ground away through relentless pressure, and when the Legion's forces finally broke and fled, the Lion pursued them ruthlessly, ensuring that they could not regroup to threaten another world. The victory at Sotha demonstrated both the Lion's strengths and his limitations as a commander in M42. He had won decisively, but only by employing resources on a scale that could not be sustained indefinitely. The casualties, though acceptable by Great Crusade standards, represented a significant percentage of the forces available in the entire sector. Replacing those losses would take years, during which other worlds would remain vulnerable. It was the eternal calculus of the 42nd millennium. Every victory had a cost, and sometimes the cost of victory was higher than the Imperium could afford. Throughout his campaigns, the Lion never forgot that he fought not for abstract concepts like glory or honor, but for the people of the Imperium. He had walked among them during his time in the shadows, had seen their suffering firsthand, and that experience had changed him. Where once he might have accepted civilian casualties as an unavoidable consequence of warfare, he now worked to minimize them when possible. He established evacuation protocols for threatened worlds, personally oversaw refugee operations, and on more than one occasion diverted military resources to humanitarian relief when doing so prevented greater long-term suffering. This concern for civilian welfare was noted by those who served with him and spread through the Imperium Nihilus. Stories circulated of the Lion personally carrying wounded civilians to medical stations, of his ordering precious supplies diverted to feed starving populations, of his stopping amid battle to ensure that non-combatants had been evacuated. These stories, whether entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, created a mythology around the Lion that differed significantly from his reputation during the Great Crusade. He was no longer simply the cold, calculating warrior, but also a protector, someone who cared about what he was fighting for, not just how to win. The question of what would happen when the Great Rift eventually closed or became passable loomed over everything the Lion did. Would he cross to join Guilliman in the Imperium proper? Would he remain in the Imperium Nihilus as its permanent protector? Would the two Primarchs find a way to work together, or would their philosophical differences lead to conflict? The Lion himself seemed uncertain about these questions. He focused on immediate problems, on the battles that needed to be won today and tomorrow, leaving grand strategy and long-term planning to others. This approach reflected both the Lion's nature and the lessons he had learned during his time healing in the forest. He had spent too much of his previous life focused on distant objectives, on positioning himself within hierarchies, on questions of honor and precedence. Those concerns had consumed energy that might have been better spent on more immediate matters. Now, returned to life in an Imperium that desperately needed defenders rather than politicians, the Lion focused on what he did best: identifying threats and destroying them. Yet the Lion could not entirely escape politics. His mere existence had political implications. Every decision he made regarding the Fallen affected not just the Dark Angels, but their 17 successor chapters and, by extension, every Space Marine chapter in the Imperium. His coordination with the Adeptus Custodes implied relationships between the Primarchs and the Emperor's Guard that had implications for Imperial governance.
His campaigns in the Imperium Nihilus established precedents for how Primarch authority interacted with existing command structures. Whether he wanted to or not, the Lion was shaping the Imperium's future through his every action. The Dark Angels themselves struggled to adapt to their Primarch's return. For 10,000 years, they had existed in a state of perpetual shame, carrying the secret of the fallen like a wound that never healed. Their entire identity had been built around this secret, their traditions shaped by the need to hunt down every fallen angel and extract confessions. The Lion's return validated their belief that he lived, but it also forced them to confront how much they had sacrificed in pursuit of redemption they could never fully achieve. Supreme Grand Master Azrael, in particular, found his role fundamentally altered. He had been the absolute authority within the Dark Angels, the keeper of their darkest secrets, the one who made decisions of life and death. Now, he served a Primarch who knew all those secrets, who had been present for the original events, and whose authority superseded Azrael's in every possible way. To Azrael's credit, he adapted to this change with grace, recognizing that serving a living Primarch was far preferable to serving the memory of one, even if it required relinquishing power he had held for decades. The relationship between the Lion and his chapter's leadership became a model for how the returned Primarchs might interact with their successors. The Lion did not simply issue commands and expect blind obedience. He consulted with his senior officers, listened to their counsel, incorporated their knowledge of how the Imperium had changed during his absence. He understood that these warriors had fought for 10,000 years without him, had developed their own traditions and wisdom, and that dismissing their experience would be both arrogant and foolish. At the same time, he made clear that when decisions needed to be made, his word was final, and he expected it to be followed without question. This balance between consultation and authority created a command structure that was more effective than either autocratic rule or democratic deliberation alone. The Lion benefited from the institutional knowledge of warriors who had spent centuries fighting in M42, while the chapter benefited from the strategic vision and tactical genius of a Primarch.
The Dark Angels' effectiveness increased noticeably after the Lion's return, not just because they had a Primarch leading them, but because that Primarch had learned how to be a better commander. As time passed and the Lion's campaigns continued, another question began to emerge. What was his ultimate purpose? During the Great Crusade, the Primarchs had been created to reunite humanity and establish the Emperor's domain across the galaxy. But that goal was no longer achievable. The Imperium controlled less territory than it had during the heresy, faced more threats, commanded fewer resources. Reconquering the galaxy was a fantasy. So what should a returned Primarch aim to accomplish? The Lion's answer to this question remained characteristically simple and direct: survival. He fought to ensure that the Imperium endured, that humanity survived, that the darkness consuming the galaxy did not extinguish the last light of human civilization. It was a modest goal compared to the grandiose ambitions of the Great Crusade, but it was honest, achievable, and more importantly, it was what the Imperium needed. The time for empire building had passed. Now was the time for defense, for holding the line, for ensuring that when the Emperor finally emerged from the Golden Throne, or the Imperium met whatever ultimate fate awaited it, humanity would still exist to see that day. This philosophy made the Lion an anomaly among the returned Primarchs. Guilliman dreamed of reforming the Imperium, of restoring some semblance of rational governance, of undoing 10,000 years of institutional decay. The Lion simply wanted to keep people alive. Where Guilliman saw problems to be solved through better administration and more efficient systems, the Lion saw enemies to be destroyed through superior tactics and overwhelming force. Neither approach was inherently superior. Both were necessary, but they reflected fundamentally different ways of understanding the Imperium's crisis. The Lion's relationship with the Ecclesiarchy became particularly complicated as his legend spread. The priests of the imperial cult wanted to incorporate the Primarch into their theology, to present him as a living saint or angel of the emperor. Some went further, suggesting that the lion's return proved the emperor's divine nature, that only a god could resurrect the dead or preserve them through 10 millennia. The lion found these developments profoundly uncomfortable. He was no saint, no angel, certainly no proof of divinity. He was simply a weapon his father had created, a tool doing the job for which he had been designed. But the lion also understood that denying the cult's claims too vigorously would cause problems. The faith of the imperial cult, whatever its theological inaccuracies, gave billions of humans the strength to endure lives of unimaginable hardship. If the lion's return could be incorporated into that faith, could inspire people to fight harder, sacrifice more, hold the line when everything seemed lost, then perhaps the theological questions were less important than the practical results. It was pragmatism rather than cynicism, recognition that in the grim darkness of the 42nd millennium, sometimes noble lies were preferable to painful truths.
The Dark Angel's gene seed remained stable and pure, one of the few blessings that had persisted through 10,000 years. Unlike some chapters that struggled with genetic degradation or mutations, the Lion Sons retained the full capabilities their Primarch had gifted them. This stability became increasingly important as the Imperium desperately sought to expand its Space Marine forces to meet the overwhelming threats it faced. Dark Angel's gene seed was used not just to replenish their own chapter and successors, but was also allocated to the new Primaris Space Marines, the enhanced warriors created by Archmagos Belisarius Call, using techniques preserved from before the heresy. The Lion's opinion of the Primaris Marines was complex. On one hand, he recognized their necessity. The Imperium needed more Space Marines, needed warriors with enhanced capabilities to face enhanced threats. On the other hand, he was deeply skeptical of anyone tinkering with his father's genecraft, no matter how brilliant they claimed to be. The original Space Marines had been carefully designed, their capabilities balanced against psychological stability and loyalty. Enhancing them risked unknown consequences, potentially creating warriors who were more powerful but less controllable. However, when the Lion actually encountered Primaris Marines in battle, his concerns diminished. They fought with the same courage and skill as their firstborn brothers, proved equally loyal, adapted to his command style without difficulty. Whatever concerns he might have about the theory behind their creation, the practical reality was that they were effective warriors who served the Emperor faithfully. That was enough. The Lion had always been more interested in results than philosophical debates, and the Primaris Marines delivered results. The integration of Primaris Marines into existing chapters created complications that the Lion sometimes had to navigate. Some chapters welcomed the reinforcements enthusiastically, seeing them as salvation for declining numbers. Others resisted, viewing the Primaris as usurpers of traditions established over millennia. The Dark Angels fell somewhere in between, accepting Primaris Marines as necessary but maintaining clear distinctions between Firstborn and the new warriors. The Lion worked to smooth these transitions, personally welcoming Primaris Marines into service, demonstrating that they were his gene sons just as much as the Firstborn warriors were. As the Lion's reputation grew throughout the Imperium Nihilus, he found himself becoming a symbol as well as a commander. People who had never seen him in person told stories about him, often wildly exaggerated. He was said to be 3 meters tall, clad in armor that blazed with golden light, wielding a sword forged by the Emperor himself. These stories bore little resemblance to reality. The Lion stood just over 3 meters tall in his armor, which was green and black rather than golden, and his sword, though powerful, was simply a well-crafted weapon. But accuracy mattered less than the effect the stories had on morale. The Lion understood that symbols mattered in ways that simple military competence did not. A population that believed a demigod protected them would fight harder,
endure more, resist the whispers of chaos more effectively than one that saw only human commanders, no matter how skilled. So he allowed the legends to grow, made appearances when possible to reinforce them, accepted that being a symbol was part of his duty just as much as being a general. It was a lesson he had never fully learned during the Great Crusade, when he had focused narrowly on tactical matters and ignored the political and psychological dimensions of leadership. The question of what would happen if and when the Lion and Guilliman finally met face to face remained a source of speculation throughout the Imperium. Their communications via astropathic relay had been professional but distant, focused on operational matters rather than personal reconciliation. Would they be able to work together? Would old rivalries resurface? Would their philosophical differences prove insurmountable? No one knew, not even the two Primarchs themselves. The Lion's opinion of his brother was mixed. He respected Guilliman's accomplishments, recognized his talents, acknowledged that the Imperium had benefited from his return. But he also saw Guilliman's limitations. The Lord Commander wanted to fix everything, to reform every broken system, to address every institutional failure. It was admirable, but ultimately futile. The Imperium was too large, too complex, too thoroughly corrupted by 10,000 years of decay to be fixed through administrative reform. What it needed was not better management, but survival, and that required warriors willing to do terrible things to preserve what remained. Yet the Lion also understood that his own approach had limitations. Pure military action could win battles, but not build civilizations. Destroying threats was necessary, but insufficient for ensuring humanity's long-term survival. In that sense, he and Guilliman complemented each other. Together, they might accomplish what neither could achieve alone, holding the line militarily while building the foundations for something better. Whether they would ever find a way to work together effectively remained to be seen. As the Lion continued his campaigns, he occasionally encountered traces of other Primarchs or evidence of their fates. Reports suggested that Lemon Russ had disappeared into the Eye of Terror on a quest whose purpose remained unclear. Vulcan was said to walk among humanity still, his immortal nature allowing him to observe and protect from the shadows. Jagatai Khan had vanished pursuing Dark Eldar into the Webway. Corvus Corax was rumored to haunt the Warp, hunting traitor Primarchs with the patience of an eternal predator. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or complete fabrications, the Lion could not say. But they suggested that he might not be the only loyalist Primarch who had survived into M42. The possibility that other loyal brothers might return gave the Lion hope. Not because he desired their company, his relationships with his brothers had always been complicated at best, but because the Imperium needed every advantage it could secure. Each returned Primarch represented not just military capability, but expertise, perspective, and authority that could help address the overwhelming challenges facing humanity.
If Russ returned with his Space Wolves, if Vulcan emerged from wherever he had hidden, if Khan rode out of the Webway at the head of the White Scars, the Imperium's chances of survival would improve dramatically. But the Lion also worried about what might happen if the traitor Primarchs returned in equal numbers. Fulgrim remained trapped within a painting on the world of Luganath, or so reports claimed. Angron had been banished back to the Warp during the First War for Armageddon. Magnus ruled his sorceress domain from the planet of the Sorcerers. Mortarion commanded plague fleets across the Imperium. Perturbo built his demon engines in the Eye of Terror. If these traitor brothers emerged in force, coordinated their actions, launched simultaneous campaigns across multiple sectors, even a dozen returned loyal Primarchs might not be enough to stop them. These concerns sometimes kept the Lion awake during the few hours each week when even a Primarch needed rest. He would stand alone in his personal quarters aboard the Invincible Reason, looking out at the stars, contemplating the immensity of the threats facing humanity. The Chaos Gods were eternal, functionally omnipotent within their own domains. The Tyranid High Fleets were endless, consuming everything in their path.
The Necrons awakened from their long sleep with technology that could unmake stars. The Orcs bred and fought with such ferocity that they could never be truly eliminated. Against such enemies, what chance did humanity really have? But then the Lion would remember the people he had walked among during his time in the shadows. The guardsmen who charged into certain death because their orders demanded it and their faith sustained them. The civilians who rebuilt their homes after every disaster, refusing to surrender to despair. The tech priests who maintained ancient machines through ritual and prayer when reason had long since failed. The Sororitas who faced demons with nothing but faith and flamer. Humanity endured because humans were stubborn, because they refused to accept that survival was impossible, because they fought and died and fought again even when logic suggested they should simply give up. That stubborn refusal to yield, that determination to survive against all odds was worth protecting. It was worth killing for, worth dying for, worth sacrificing everything to preserve. The Lion had been created to be humanity's defender, and he would fulfill that purpose until the last human fell or until he himself was destroyed. It was not complicated, not philosophical, not grand. It was simply duty, the acceptance that he had been made for a purpose and would serve that purpose regardless of cost. In the end, the story of Lion El'Jonson, first of the Primarchs, is a story about transformation. He began as a savage surviving alone in a nightmare forest, became a knight crusading against monsters, transformed into a general leading armies across the stars, fell into darkness and loss when his world burned and his mentor betrayed him, and finally emerged 10,000 years later as something more than he had been.
The cold, calculating warrior remained, but now he understood not just how to win battles, but why those battles mattered. The Lion never became warm or gregarious, never developed the easy charisma of Horus or the political skill of Guilliman. He remained distant, secretive, difficult to read, and harder to understand. But he had learned compassion, had developed empathy, had come to understand that the people he protected were not merely assets to be deployed, but individuals deserving of care and consideration. That transformation, more than any tactical genius or martial prowess, might be his greatest achievement. As the Lion continues his campaigns across the Imperium Nihilus, his legend grows. To the people of the dark half of the galaxy, he is the shield of the Emperor, the protector, the one who stands between them and annihilation. To his dark angels, he is their redeemer, proof that their Primarch lives and that their 10,000-year burden of shame was not borne in vain. To the wider Imperium, he is hope made manifest, living proof that even when all seems lost, salvation might appear from unexpected quarters. The future remains uncertain. The Great Rift still divides the Imperium. Chaos presses on every border. Countless Xenos threats loom in the darkness. The Emperor remains imprisoned upon the Golden Throne, his will unknowable, his plans unfathomable. But the Lion stands ready, sword in hand, determined to defend humanity for as long as he draws breath. He is the first, the prototype, the hunter who learned to care about his prey even as he learned better how to protect it. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that might be enough.